My name is Celestine Brooks, and I've lived 81 years on this earth, most of them right here in Bamberg, South Carolina. Down here, the summer air gets so heavy and thick with the smell of jasmine and damp earth, it feels like you could grab a fistful of it. I've always thought that if a secret had a scent, it would smell just like that. Sweet on the surface, but heavy enough to choke you if you breathe it in too deep. I had 4 children they called miracles. 4 blessings from the Lord, they said, born of a union touched by God's own hand. But every time I held one of them, so small and helpless in my arms, a piece of my own soul felt like it was dying. The whole town looked at me with a kind of awe, whispering about the pastor's spiritual wife. That's what he called me. It was a title that was supposed to be an honor, a sacred thing. But for me, it became a cage. Bamberg ain't a big place. Never has been. It's the kind of town where the steeple of the Mount Zion Baptist Church is the first thing you see coming in and the last thing you see going out. It's the heart of everything. I remember the sound of its bell on a Sunday morning, how it would roll over the fields and find you, no matter where you were. It was a sound of comfort, of community. Or so I thought. Our house was small, but Mama, Martha was her name, kept it clean and filled with the smell of baking bread and boiled peanuts. My daddy, Eugene, was a quiet man, worked his hands to the bone 6 days a week, and gave his heart to the Lord on the 7th. They believed in the power of faith with a purity that was beautiful. But, well, a faith that pure can be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. It can make you blind. I remember sitting on our porch swing with Daddy on cool evenings, listening to the cicadas start their nightly sermon. He'd tell me stories, simple ones, about his own childhood. That was before the nights started feeling colder, even in the middle of July, before the pastor's shadow started falling across our doorstep. People in town saw me as this quiet, blessed girl, the one chosen for something special. They saw the public smiles, the downcast eyes in church, the way I carried myself with a kind of fragile dignity. They all thought they knew my story, the one Pastor Caldwell spun from the pulpit, but they only knew the version he wanted them to hear. The truth, the real story, was buried so deep inside me. I sometimes wonder how it didn't just crack my ribs and spill out onto the church floor. I've held it in for more than 60 years. A secret that started on a stormy night when I was just 15 years old. If this old woman's story has found a little corner in your heart, maybe you'll consider subscribing and staying a while. Follow along, and I'll tell you the rest. I'll tell you what really happened behind the closed doors of the parsonage and how I found my way out of the dark. You know, a person's life can change in a single heartbeat. One moment, you're on a path that seems as straight and clear as a country road in the morning sun, and the next, a storm rolls in and washes that whole road away. Looking back now, from the far side of 81 years, I sometimes wonder if that storm was a part of God's plan, or if it was just the work of a man who was real good at making his own desires sound like the word of the Lord. When you're 15, you don't know the difference. At 15, God is like your own grandpa, a comforting presence, a voice of love, someone who would never, ever let any real harm come to you. You trust what you're told. You believe in the goodness of the people who are meant to guide you. That's the most dangerous part of being a child. You don't yet know that the shepherds are sometimes the worst kind of wolves. The man who changed my path was Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell. He wasn't just the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist. He was Mount Zion Baptist. He was a big man, not so much in height, but in presence. When he stood at the pulpit, his voice filled up every corner of that sanctuary, deep and resonant like a church organ. It could soothe a crying baby or make a sinner tremble in the pews. His eyes, Lord, his eyes were the kind that made you feel seen. He'd look out over the congregation, and you'd swear he was looking right into your soul, finding all the little hidden fears and hopes you kept locked away. People said he had a direct line to the Almighty, that he wrestled with angels in his sleep and came back with messages for us all. And we believed him. My mama and daddy, they hung on his every word like it was gospel truth fallen straight from heaven. He was a pillar of our community, a man of God. And there ain't nothing more dangerous in this world than a holy man with unholy appetites. It all started on a Tuesday night in late August. A storm was tearing through Bamberg, the kind that makes you feel small and helpless. The wind was howling like a lost soul, and the thunder was so loud it shook the preserves right on the shelves in Mama's kitchen. The rain was coming down in sheets, slapping against the windows of our little house. We were all huddled in the front room, listening to the storm, when there came a knock on the door. It was a firm, important kind of knock, not one you'd expect on a night like that. Daddy opened it, and there he stood, Pastor Caldwell, with the storm raging behind him, like he'd brought it with him. Rain was dripping from the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his dark coat. He looked like something out of the Old Testament. He stepped inside, bringing the smell of rain and wet wool with him. My mama, her hands fluttering to her chest, just staring like an angel had descended. The pastor's eyes scanned the room and settled on me. I was sitting in the corner, trying to make myself small, but under his gaze, I felt like I was standing on a stage under a bright light. He didn't smile. He just looked at me for a long moment, and then he turned to my parents. I'll never forget the words he used. He told them he'd been praying, wrestling with the Spirit for weeks, and that God had come to him in a dream. In this dream, the Lord had shown him my face. He said God told him I was special, that I had been chosen for a divine mission, a purpose higher than any of us could understand. I watched my parents' faces as he spoke. Daddy's jaw was slack with awe. Mama started to cry, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of joy, of overwhelming pride. The pastor came over and took my hand. His own was warm and clammy, and a shiver went right up my arm. He looked down at me, and then back at my folks. Celestine, he announced, his voice booming even over the thunder outside, has been blessed. The Lord has spoken to me. He has revealed that she is to be my spiritual wife. Spiritual wife. The words hung in the air, strange and heavy. I didn't know what they meant. Not really. But I saw the look on my parents' faces. Ecstasy. Pure, unadulterated joy that their daughter, their Celestine, had been singled out by God himself. She has been chosen to aid me in a sacred covenant, the pastor said, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of my hand. A union of the Spirit, ordained by the Most High. In that moment, sitting there in our humble front room, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. It was a feeling so powerful, so deep, it drowned out the sound of the storm. I looked from the pastor's piercing eyes to my mother's tear-streaked, smiling face, and then to my father, who was nodding his head slowly, like he was witnessing a miracle. Everyone in that room thought I was being blessed. Everyone saw it as an honor. But all I could feel was the cold, terrifying certainty that my life, the simple, quiet life of Celestine Brooks, was over. I was 15 years old, and my own parents were handing me over, all smiles and grateful tears. They thought they were giving me to God. I was the only one who felt, deep down in my bones, that they were giving me to him. He called it a divine mission, a sacred honor. But as he stood there, holding my hand while the storm raged, I knew it wasn't a blessing. It was a branding. And from that night on, my life was no longer my own. After that stormy night, a strange quiet fell over our house. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, though. It was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. My mama started looking at me different, with a kind of holy reverence that made my skin crawl. She'd stop what she was doing just to watch me read my Bible. A soft, proud smile on her face. Daddy didn't say much, but he'd clear his throat and stand up straighter whenever I walked into a room, like I wasn't his daughter anymore, but some visiting dignitary. They stopped asking me about my chores or my schooling. All they wanted to talk about was my mission. They'd use the words Pastor Caldwell had used, rolling them around in their mouths like precious jewels. Divine purpose, sacred union, God's chosen. They were so blinded by the light of it all, they never once thought to ask me if I was afraid of the dark. And I was. I was terrified. But it was a quiet, deep-down terror that had no words. How do you tell your own mama and daddy that the man they see as God's own mouthpiece makes a cold dread curl in your belly? How do you explain that his blessing feels like a curse? You don't. You swallow it down and it sits in your gut like a stone. So I started going to see him. Pastor Caldwell said it was for spiritual guidance, to prepare me for our holy covenant. We'd meet in his office at the church, a place I used to love. It always smelled of old paper from the books that lined his walls, and lemon polish from the heavy oak desk that stood between us like an altar. The afternoon sun would spill through the big stained glass window behind him, the one with Moses holding the commandments, and it would paint him in colors of deep blue and blood red. It made him look righteous, anointed. He never raised his voice. He was always gentle, his words smooth and sweet as honey. He'd take my hand. He was always taking my hand, and he'd read to me from the Bible. But he'd pick the strange parts, the stories of the prophets and their women, the verses about sacrifice and obedience. He'd twist them and turn them until they sounded like they were written just for us. He told me that our union was like Abraham and Hagar, a holy necessity for a divine purpose that common folks couldn't possibly understand. He said my youth and purity were a gift I was meant to lay at the Lord's feet, and he was just the vessel God had chosen to receive it. He praised my quietness, calling it a sign of a submissive spirit. He was so convincing. His voice was like a slow, warm river, and I could feel myself being carried away by the current. There were moments, sitting there on that stiff chair across from him, that a part of me, the scared 15-year-old girl, would try to scream. But another part, the part that had sung hymns every Sunday since I could talk, wanted so desperately to believe him. It was easier to think I was special than to accept the horrible truth, that this holy man was a liar, and that my own family was leading me to slaughter like a lamb. So I prayed. Lord, how I prayed. I'd get on my knees by my bed at night and I'd beg God for a sign, for some proof that this was truly his will. And when a bird sang outside my window the next morning, I'd tell myself, that's it. That's the sign. I was building my own cage, bar by bar, just to make sense of it all. The final lock was clicked into place about a week before the ceremony. Pastor Caldwell told me it was time for me to meet his wife, Sister Rebecca. My blood ran cold. All this time, she'd been a ghost in the story, a faceless woman I couldn't bear to think about. I imagined she'd be a woman scorned, full of fire and righteous fury. I pictured her calling me a sinner, a homewrecker. I was ready for her hatred. In a strange way, I think I was hoping for it. Her anger would have been a relief. It would have proven that my fear was right. He took me to the parsonage, a big white house next to the church that always seemed so perfect from the outside. He led me into the parlor, a stuffy room filled with dark furniture and doilies on everything, and there she was, sitting in a wingback chair. Sister Rebecca wasn't what I expected at all. She was a thin, tired-looking woman with pale skin and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, settled sadness. There were faint lines of worry etched around her mouth, even when she smiled. And she did smile at me. It was a practiced, gentle smile that didn't quite reach her weary eyes. The pastor stood behind her chair, a hand on her shoulder, like a proud king showing off his kingdom. Sister Rebecca stood up and walked toward me. She took both of my hands in hers. Her skin was cool and dry, like old paper. I braced myself, but she just looked at me, her gaze searching my face, and then her eyes filled with tears. "Celestine," she whispered, her voice fragile as a dried leaf. "Jeremiah has told me everything. He's told me about the Lord's vision for you." She squeezed my hands. "I just want you to know, I am honored. I am truly honored to share my husband with a servant of the Lord as pure as you." She said it with such conviction, such pious surrender, that all the air went out of my lungs. This wasn't the angry, betrayed wife I had prepared for. This was another believer, another follower. The one person on this earth who should have stood up and screamed "no" was instead blessing the whole affair. That was the moment my last bit of fight flickered out. If she, his wife, believed it, then who was I to doubt? My fear, my dread, my gut feeling that this was all terribly wrong? It must have been my own sin, my own pride getting in the way of God's plan. I left the parsonage that day in a daze, the world muted and blurry around me. The plans for the spiritual union moved forward. It was to be a small thing, held in a back room of the church on a Thursday afternoon. My mama sewed me a simple white dress, hummin' hymns of praise while her needle went in and out, in and out. She never saw the tears I was swallowin'. The day of the ceremony, I stood in my little room, holding that plain dress up to my body. I looked at my reflection in the wavy glass of my mirror and didn't recognize the girl staring back at me. She looked hollow, empty. Looking at that plain white dress, I realized there was no one left to fight, not even myself. Sister Rebecca's words had been the final lock on the cage. As I stood there, I told myself that if God's will felt this much like drowning, then I just had to learn how to breathe underwater. The ceremony, if you could call it that, happened on a Thursday. The air in that little back room of the church was thick and smelled of dust and old, forgotten things. It wasn't a wedding. There was no joy, no music, just the low, solemn drone of Pastor Caldwell's voice as he recited scriptures I didn't recognize. My mama and daddy were there, their faces shining with a kind of tearful pride that broke my heart all over again. The deacons stood with their hands clasped, their expressions stern and pious. And Sister Rebecca, she stood by my side, and when the pastor declared us spiritually bound, she placed a trembling, cool hand on my arm and whispered, "Welcome to the family, dear." It felt like the closing of a tomb. That afternoon, I moved into the parsonage. I wasn't to be in the main house, of course. My place was a small, damp room off the back of the kitchen, what they called the annex. It had a narrow bed, a single window that looked out onto a brick wall, and a constant smell of mildew and lye soap. There was a Bible on the nightstand, always open to the Psalms, as if to remind me that even in this little cell, God was watching. My life fell into a strange, silent rhythm. During the day, I was a ghost in that house. I'd help Sister Rebecca with the canning or the mending, and we'd work for hours without speaking a word. There was a gulf between us, an understanding that was too terrible to ever be spoken aloud. We were two planets orbiting the same sun, keeping to our own paths, never colliding. I'd go to church on Sundays and sit in the front pew, a living symbol of the pastor's power. I learned how to keep my eyes downcast, how to wear a look of serene humility. I could feel the eyes of the whole congregation on me. The women would whisper behind their hymnals, their glances a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. The men would look at me, then at the pastor, and then quickly away, a flicker of something I didn't understand in their eyes. I wasn't Celestine Brooks anymore. I was a spectacle. A secret everyone knew, but no one dared to name. The nights were the hardest. Those were his times. He would come to my little room after Sister Rebecca was asleep. He never called it what it was. He'd say he was there to pray with me, to strengthen our spiritual bond. He'd sit on the edge of my bed, his big frame making the whole thing sag, and he'd talk in that low, hypnotic voice. He'd tell me that my body was a temple, and my duty was to welcome the Spirit of the Lord with him as the vessel. At first, I would just lie there, stiff as a board, feeling my own spirit float up to a corner of the ceiling, watching the whole sad, ugly scene from a distance. I'd count the cracks in the plaster and pray, not for him to stop, but for me to just disappear completely. He'd call my trembling a sign of the Holy Spirit moving through me. He'd call my tears a baptism of joy. He twisted everything, every last shred of my fear and pain, into something holy. And the worst part is, some nights, exhausted and confused, I almost believed him. Because believing the lie was less painful than facing the truth. This went on for months. I was 16, then I was 17. I felt ancient. My life was measured in silent days and terrifying nights. Then, one spring morning, the world tilted on its axis. It started with a sickness in my stomach that wouldn't go away, a weariness in my bones that sleep couldn't fix. I knew. Deep down, in that place where a woman's knowledge lives, I knew. I was pregnant. The first emotion that hit me wasn't joy or hope. It was a tidal wave of pure animal terror. This was proof, a secret that was growing inside me, a truth my own body was about to scream to the world. I thought, this is it. This is the end. I imagined being cast out, shamed, a scarlet letter burning on my chest for the whole town to see. For a fleeting moment, I even thought this might be my escape, Surely, now, the lie would have to crumble. When I finally got the courage to tell him, my voice was barely a whisper. We were in his office, the afternoon sun cast in its red and blue light all around him. He listened, his face unreadable. I braced myself for his fury, for his denial. But he didn't get angry. A slow smile spread across his face, a look of triumphant vindication. "A miracle," he said, his voice soft with awe. "Celestine, this is a sign from God himself. He has blessed our sacred union." I just stared at him, my mind unable to process his words. This wasn't a disaster to him. This was a victory. And then he did the cruelest thing he had ever done. The following Sunday, the church was packed. He stood at the pulpit, his Bible in his hand, and he looked right at me, sitting there in the front row in my plainest dress. He preached a sermon about Hannah and Samuel, about barren women and promised children. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would break right through my ribs. Then he paused. He looked out at the faces of the congregation, and he raised his hands. "My beloved," he boomed, his voice filling the sanctuary, "today we are witness to a miracle. The Lord has seen fit to bless the sacred spiritual covenant he ordained. He is sending us a prophetic child, born of this holy union." A gasp went through the crowd. All at once, every eye in that church turned to me. They stared at my belly, hidden beneath the folds of my dress. And then, the silence was broken. It started with a few women crying, then someone started clapping, and soon the whole church was on its feet, singing hymns of praise, their voices rising to the rafters. They were celebrating. They were celebrating my shame, my terror, my cage. As they sang, I felt the first tiny flutter of life inside me. I wasn't a girl with a secret anymore. I had become the secret itself, a story he was writing for the whole world to read. I knew then that I was walking on holy ground that was bound to crumble, and there was absolutely nowhere left for me to run. My firstborn, my little Samuel, was a beautiful baby. He had my eyes but his father's serious expression, even as an infant. The people of Bamberg treated him like a prince. They'd bring gifts to the parsonage, little knitted booties, jars of honey, hand-carved wooden toys. Women would stop me on the street, their faces soft with reverence, and ask if they could just touch him, as if his little hand held a blessing from God. And I would let them. I'd stand there with a quiet, empty smile on my face while they cooed over my son, the living, breathing proof of my holy servitude. Sister Rebecca was a different kind of mother to him. She would hold him with a quiet, desperate sadness, as if she was trying to pour all the love she couldn't give her own situation into this child. We were a strange, broken family, bound together by a miracle that was really a tragedy. I was a mother, but I felt more like a vessel, a walking, talking story that belonged to everyone but me. Time folded in on itself. The days were long and silent, marked by the rhythms of a baby, nursing, sleeping, crying. The nights still belonged to the pastor. His visits to my little room in the annex didn't stop. If anything, the birth of Samuel had only strengthened his belief in his own divine right. He'd tell me that God demanded our union be fruitful, that we were populating the earth with a new generation of prophets. And before Samuel could even walk, I was pregnant again. This time, there was no grand announcement from the pulpit. It was just accepted, a known fact. Celestine was fulfilling her purpose. When my second son David was born, I was just 19 years old. I held him to my chest, this tiny, perfect new life, and I felt a weariness so profound it settled deep in my bones. I was a child myself, mother to two of the pastor's sons, trapped in a story that kept writing new chapters without my permission. The truth, when it finally came, wasn't delivered by an angel or a vision. It came from the cracked, gentle lips of an old woman named Dorothy May. Dorothy May had been the cleaning lady at Mount Zion Baptist since before I was born. She was a small, stooped woman with skin like wrinkled parchment and hands gnarled from a lifetime of scrubbing floors and polishing pews. She was part of the church like the smell of wax or the feel of the worn-out hymnals. She was so quiet and ever-present that I think most people, including the pastor, forgot she had eyes and ears. One evening, I was in the church basement, folding the baptismal robes. The air was cool and smelled of damp stone and bleach. My boys were asleep upstairs in the nursery. Dorothy May was there, quietly sweeping in the corner. She came over to me, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at me with that awe or pity I saw in everyone else's eyes. She looked at me with a deep, knowing sorrow that felt ancient. "That new one?" she whispered, her voice raspy like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "He favors you." I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the white cloth in my hands. She leaned in closer, and the smell of peppermint was on her breath. "You're a good mama, child. You love them babies, but you gotta be careful." A chill went through me. I looked up at her, and her dark eyes were filled with a warning. "He told you were special, didn't he?" she murmured, her gaze darting toward the stairs. "That God chose you?" I just stared at her, my heart beginning to thump a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Child," she said, her voice dropping so low I could barely hear it. "Listen to me. Before you, there was another, and another before her. I've been here a long time. I've seen things." The white robe slipped from my hands onto the dusty floor. She told me there had been 5 others. 5 other spiritual wives over the years. Young girls, just like me. She whispered their stories like a prayer for the dead. She told me about a girl whose family suddenly packed up and moved to Georgia in the middle of the night. Their house left empty, without a single goodbye. She told me about another who was sent away on a mission to some far-off state. A girl who used to write to her mother every week until the letters just stopped. My hands started to tremble. The whole basement seemed to tilt, the shelves of cleaning supplies blurring at the edges. And then she told me the last story, the one that shattered my world into a million tiny pieces. "There was one," she whispered, her own voice thick with an old pain. "Her name was Sarah Ellen, a sweet girl with hair like spun gold. The pastor told everyone the same thing, that she was chosen. She had a baby by him, but she was so young, so small. She died right in childbirth. She was only 18. 18. The word hung in the damp air between us. 18. Sarah Ellen. A name, a real girl, a girl who had died living the same blessed life I was living. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I wasn't part of some grand divine plan. I was just the next one on the list. The cold dread that had lived in my stomach for years suddenly had a name: Sarah Ellen. The pastor wasn't a vessel of God. He was a predator, a monster who collected girls, used them up, and discarded them. Some he sent away. One he had left to die. This whole time, the town had been watching a play, but only Dorothy May and the ghosts of 5 other girls knew the final act. If my story is teaching you anything, I hope you'll subscribe, because understanding the truth is the first step to surviving it. The names of those girls echoed in my head, a silent roll call of ghosts. I looked at my own 2 babies sleeping in their cradle when I got back to my room, and for the first time, I didn't see miracles. I saw a pattern, and I knew, with a certainty that froze my soul, that I was just one more lamb in a line for the slaughter. My special mission from God was a lie. The truth was, I was living in a graveyard, and the pastor was still digging graves. After Dorothy May whispered those names to me in the church basement, the world went sharp and terrible. It was like I'd been living my life underwater, everything blurry and muted, and suddenly my head had broken the surface. I could finally breathe, but the air was so cold it burned my lungs. The name Sarah Ellen became a stone in my shoe, a constant painful reminder with every step I took. I looked at my 2 little boys, Samuel and David, sleeping in their shared cradle, and a new kind of love washed over me. It was fierce and sharp-edged, a mother bear's love, filled with the terrifying knowledge of what I had to protect them from. Their father wasn't just a liar, he was a collector of souls, and I was afraid he had already laid claim to theirs. My life in the parsonage became a performance. Every smile I gave the pastor was an act of treason against my own heart. Every time he touched me in that little room in the annex, I would picture Sarah Ellen's ghost standing in the corner, watching me. His words, which once had the power to confuse and console me, now sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin. He'd read the Bible to me, his voice smooth and righteous, and all I could hear were the lies. He'd talk about God's grand design, and I would think about the girls he'd sent away, the lives he'd erased. The tension inside me was a constant, high-pitched scream that no one else could hear. I had to be meeker than ever, more obedient, more pious. I learned that when you're living with a monster, the most important thing is to never, ever let him know you can see his claws. I got pregnant again. It was almost a relief when I found out, because the not knowing, the waiting for the other shoe to drop, was its own kind of torture. At least this was a familiar path. By the time my daughter, Leah, was born, I was 21 years old, 3 children. I had outlasted Sarah Ellen. The thought brought me no comfort, only a chilling sense of borrowed time. Holding my baby girl, so tiny and new, I felt a resolve hardening in my soul. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was just a cold, hard certainty that I would not let her life be a repeat of mine. I would not let the pastor's shadow fall over her future. The town saw me as a blessed vessel, a fruitful branch of the pastor's holy tree. They had no idea I was really a prisoner, counting the minutes, searching for a crack in the wall of my cell. The crack appeared on a hot, still afternoon when Leah was just a few months old. The pastor was out, visiting a sick member of the congregation, performing his duties as a shepherd, while the wolves ran free in his own home. The air in the kitchen was thick and suffocating, the silence broken only by the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. I was sitting at the table, just staring at the wall, feeling the weight of everything pressed down on me. Sister Rebecca was there, churning butter, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the dasher, the only heartbeat in the room. I suppose she saw something in my face, a bleakness that I couldn't hide anymore. She stopped her work. The silence that fell was heavy and absolute. She walked over and sat down across from me. For a long time, she just looked at me with those weary, sad eyes of hers. I thought she was going to give me another one of her pious little speeches about duty and sacrifice. I braced myself for it. But instead, her face, that carefully constructed mask of serene acceptance, just crumbled. Her lips trembled, and a single tear traced a path through the fine powder on her cheek. Then another. Soon, she was covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaken with silent, racking sobs. I'd never seen her cry like that, not with tears of joy or piety, but with the gut-wrenching grief of a lost soul. When she finally looked up, the woman staring back at me was a stranger. The pastor's perfect, compliant wife was gone, and in her place was a terrified, broken woman. "He didn't tell you, did he?" she whispered, her voice raw. "About what he does, about what he threatens." And then it all came pouring out of her, a flood of words held back for years. She told me she had never agreed to any of it, not with me, not with the ones before me. She told me that when she first fought him on it, years ago, he had locked her in her room for 3 days with nothing but bread and water, reading scriptures to her through the door about the damnation that awaited a rebellious wife. He told her that if she ever exposed him, God would strike down her entire family, that her mother would get sick, that her brother would die in an accident. He twisted her faith and her love for her family into a weapon and held it to her throat. "I tried to leave him once," she confessed, her eyes wild with the memory. "Years ago, I packed a bag and got on a bus. He found me in the very next town. He dragged me back, smiling at everyone, telling them his poor wife had gotten confused and wandered off. But when we got home, the things he said God would do to me." She couldn't finish. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She reached across the table and grabbed my hands, her grip surprisingly strong. Her skin was cold as ice. "Celestine," she whispered, her eyes pleading with me to understand. "We are both prisoners in this house." In that moment, the world didn't just tilt, it was remade. The woman I had seen as my jailer, the pious accomplice to my misery, was just another prisoner in the cell next to mine. She was a victim, just like me, just like Sarah Ellen. The lines of the battlefield shifted. It was no longer me against them. It was us against him, A fragile, terrifying alliance was forged in that suffocating kitchen, a bond of shared terror and survival. She held my hands, and her tears felt as hot as my own. I thought knowing about the other girls was the worst thing in the world, but I was wrong. I didn't imagine that finding my only ally would be the most dangerous thing of all. After Sister Rebecca's confession in the kitchen, the air in the parsonage changed. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was full of the things we couldn't say. Our alliance was a fragile, secret thing, a tiny candle flame in a house full of drafts. We never spoke of that conversation again, but the bond was there, woven into the fabric of our days. It was in the way she'd pour me a cup of coffee without asking, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second too long. It was in the way I'd find a warm, folded blanket at the foot of my bed in the annex on a cold night. It was in the shared, knowing glances we'd exchange over the heads of my children as they played on the floor. A silent acknowledgement of the precious, terrible secret we both kept. For the first time in years, I wasn't entirely alone in my fear. And that small taste of solidarity, as dangerous as it was, felt like breathing after being held underwater. We found small, stolen moments of peace. On warm afternoons, while the pastor was away on his pastoral visits and my 3 little ones were napping, we'd sit on the back porch steps, hidden from the street. We'd shell peas into a large metal bowl, the rhythmic plink, 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 a comfort in sound. In those quiet minutes, the years would fall away from her face, and she'd tell me about her life before. She'd talk about her dream of being a school teacher, the way she loved to read poetry, the plans she'd had. She spoke of a girl I'd never known, a girl who hadn't yet learned that a man's love could be a cage. I'd listen, and I'd see my own lost dreams reflected in her sad eyes. These weren't conversations about escape. We never dared to speak that word. They were just testimony. The quiet act of 2 prisoners admitting to each other that they remembered what the sun felt like. But in a town like Bamberg, nothing goes unnoticed. Our small, silent friendship became the newest grist for the gossip mill. At the church potlucks, I'd see the women of the congregation watching us. Their whispers followed me down the aisles of the general store. The looks were different now. The pity that used to be reserved for me, the young, spiritual wife, was now being ladled out for Sister Rebecca. I'd hear snippets of it carried on the breeze. Poor Sister Rebecca. She looks so worn out. That Celestine girl is spending more and more time with her. It ain't seemly. It's one thing to accept the Lord's will, but another to let that girl act like she's the true lady of the house. They saw our solidarity not as a comfort, but as a transgression. They saw 2 women finding solace in each other, and they decided it was a scandal. The pastor, of course, heard the whispers too. In fact, looking back, I'm sure he was the one conducting the whole choir. One evening, he called us both into his office. The air was cold, even though it was summer, and the smell of his lemon polish and old books suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. He sat behind his big oak desk, the stained glass light painting him in the colors of a vengeful god. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was so much worse. He folded his large hands on his Bible. "Ladies," he began, his voice full of a deep, sorrowful concern. "I have been hearing things, murmurs among the flock." He looked at Rebecca. "They are worried about you, my dear. They say you seem burdened, that your spirit is being troubled. They see your closeness with Celestine, and they are confused. It is causing a disruption to the holy order of things." Then he turned his gaze on me. His eyes were like chips of ice. "And you, Celestine, your position here is one of sacred humility. Your growing familiarity with the pastor's wife is unseemly. It is making people question the purity of this entire covenant. It is making me look weak." He let that hang in the air. He was a master. He wasn't accusing us of plotting against him. He was accusing us of making him look bad, of threatening his ministry. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that smooth, hypnotic tone he used when he was twisting a soul into a new shape. "This is a test from the Lord," he said. "Satan is trying to sow discord in this house and in this church by using gossip and suspicion. and the only way to fight him is with piety and propriety. You must keep a holy distance from each other. Your friendship, as well-intentioned as it may be, has become a stumbling block for the faith of others. He was using their faith, our faith, as a weapon against us. He was commanding us to rebuild the wall between us, for the good of God. We walked out of his office, and we didn't look at each other. We couldn't. The message was clear. The small kindnesses had to stop. The shared glances, the quiet moments on the porch, they were all over. We were to be strangers again, living in the same house. He hadn't raised his voice, but he had built a wall of whispers between us that was higher and colder than any stone. He used the town's wagging tongues as his hammer, and their piety as his nails. I learned something new and terrible about him that day. The cruelest cages aren't made of iron bars, but of other people's prayers, and we had just been locked inside one. The wall of whispers the pastor had built between me and Sister Rebecca was solid and cold. We went back to being ghosts in the same house, our paths crossing in the kitchen or the hallway with nothing more than a flicker of the eyes. But the silence now was different. It was heavier, filled with the weight of our shared, unspoken truth. My loneliness returned, deeper and more absolute than before, because now I knew there was an ally just feet away, and I couldn't reach her. The days began to blur into one long gray expanse of chores and childcare, of feigning piety in the face of my captor. I could feel myself starting to fray at the edges. I'd look in the mirror and see a stranger with haunted eyes. I was terrified of disappearing completely, of becoming the hollowed-out woman Sister Rebecca had been for so many years. The thing I was most at risk of losing now wasn't just my freedom, but my own mind. One Saturday, a rare opportunity fell into my lap. The pastor and Sister Rebecca were to attend a regional church conference in Columbia, an overnight trip. It was the first time I would be truly alone in the parsonage since my arrival. He gave me a list of chores to complete in his absence, and at the top of the list, in his neat, authoritative script, were the words, "Thoroughly dust and organize my office." His office, the room I avoided at all costs, the place where my life had been redefined in shades of stained glass and false scripture. A cold fear washed over me, but beneath it, something else stirred. A desperate, dangerous curiosity. For years, I had been the subject of his story. For one day, I needed to see the author's notes. I needed to understand the architecture of my own prison. After they left, the house was eerily quiet. I fed the children their lunch and put them down for their naps, my heart thumping with a nervous rhythm. Then I walked to his office. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of old books and lemon polish seemed to wrap around me, threatening to choke me. I started to dust, my hands trembling as I moved his papers, his books, his perfectly aligned pens. My eyes kept drifting to the heavy oak desk. It was his throne, the source of his power. On a whim, I pulled at the top drawer. It slid open easily, just church bulletins and stationery. I tried the second, the same. Then I tried the wide, shallow drawer in the center, right where his Bible usually lay. It was locked. A jolt went through me. A locked drawer. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the room, my eyes darting everywhere. On a small silver dish on his bookshelf, amongst some stray coins and paper clips, lay a small, ornate brass key. It looked like a key for a diary. My hand moved before my mind could stop it. I snatched the key, my palm sweating as I returned to the desk. With a click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent house, the lock turned. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, there was no money, no scandalous letters. It was worse. There was a small, black, leather-bound ledger, the kind a shopkeeper might use. And beside it, a Bible, so heavily used the gold on the page edges had worn away completely. My hand, seeming to belong to someone else, reached for the ledger first. I opened it. The first page had a title, written in his spidery script, "The Lord's Special Servants," and below it, a list of names and dates. Mary Ann Peters, 1948. Elizabeth Grace Collier, 1951. And then, a name that made all the air leave my body. Sarah Ellen Foster, 1953. Beside each name was a chillingly brief note. Beside Mary Ann's, family relocated to Georgia, mission complete. Beside Elizabeth's, sent to serve in Tennessee ministry, obedient. And beside Sarah Ellen's, the words that made me want to be sick right there on the polished floor. Lost in childbirth, the Lord's will. I flipped the page with a shaking finger, and there it was. Celestine Brooks, 1957. And his note? A quiet spirit. Very promising. Parents are devout and cooperative. I was just a project. A name in a book of broken girls. The special mission was a process, a system. I felt a cold, horrifying clarity wash over me. Then I picked up the Bible. It fell open to a well-worn page in the Old Testament. The verses he had used on me, on my parents, were all underlined. But in the margins, in his own handwriting, were his tactical, soul-destroying notes. Next to a verse about a wife's submission, he'd written, "Effective for countering wifely jealousy." Next to a story about a prophet's concubine, he'd scribbled, "Use for the initial conversation with the parents. Emphasizes divine precedent." It wasn't twisted faith. It was a playbook. A cold, calculated recipe for breaking souls. I put the Bible down, my hands now steady. The fear was still there, but it had been burned clean of all confusion. I was no longer a confused girl wrestling with God's will. I was a victim of a meticulous predator, and I was holding the evidence in my hands. I carefully placed the ledger and the Bible back in the drawer, turned the key in the lock, and wiped my fingerprints from the brass handle with the edge of my apron. I had gone in there looking for an answer, for some way to understand the man who had ruined my life. But what I found was so much worse than a monster. I found a blueprint, a cold, calculated recipe for breaking girls, and my name was just the latest ingredient. The secret I now held wasn't just my story anymore. It was a testament of the dead and the disappeared. And it was heavy enough to get us all killed. The sound of the pastor's Ford crunching on the gravel driveway was the sound of my brief, terrifying freedom coming to an end. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the sink, and took a deep breath, schooling my face into the same placid, humble mask I wore every day. But on the inside, everything was screaming. The knowledge of that little black book, his methodical ledger of ruined lives, was a live thing, a frantic bird beating its wings against my ribs. When he walked in, smiling his benevolent, pastoral smile, it took every ounce of my will not to recoil. Every word he spoke that evening felt like a lie coated in honey. When he said grace over our simple dinner, thanking the Lord for his two families, spiritual and worldly, I had to stare down at my plate to keep him from seeing the raw hatred in my eyes. I felt like a spy, a traitor in my own life, gathering intelligence for a war no one else knew was being fought. The days that followed were the most tense of my life. The air in the parsonage was thick with unspoken things, a silence so loud it hurt my ears. My secret knowledge changed how I saw everything. I watched him now, not as a confused and frightened girl, but as a student of my enemy. I saw the way he'd subtly turn a conversation back to himself, the way he'd use a gentle touch on someone's arm to assert his power, the way his eyes would glaze over with a chilling emptiness even when he was smiling. I watched Sister Rebecca, too, and saw her with a new, heartbreaking clarity. I saw the tiny, almost imperceptible flinch when he entered a room, the way she'd hold her breath until he passed by, the practiced way she steered conversations away from anything that might upset him. We were two mice living in a house with a very patient cat, and now I knew exactly where he kept his claws. The urge to tell her what I'd found was a constant, physical ache, but I couldn't. The wall of whispers was still there, and I knew if he suspected we were communicating, he'd find a way to punish her for it. The fear of imminent discovery was a poison I swallowed every morning. The tension finally broke in a place I never expected. About a month after I found the ledger, Sister Rebecca seemed to be in a listless, melancholy fog. She asked me to help her clear out the old storage closet at the top of the stairs, a place filled with things the church no longer used. "It all just needs to be thrown out," she said, her voice flat and colorless. The closet was musty and dark, smelling of mothballs and time. It was filled with dusty boxes of old Christmas decorations, yellowed choir robes, and stacks of dried-out palm fronds from a dozen Palm Sundays past. I was reaching for a heavy box in the back when my fingers brushed against something wooden tucked behind it. It was a small, plain pine box, no bigger than a shoebox. It wasn't a church item. It looked personal. I pulled it out, wiping the thick layer of dust from the lid. There was no name on it. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to open it. Sister Rebecca had her back to me, sorting through a pile of old hymnals. I lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of sad, forgotten things. A tarnished silver locket with the engraving worn smooth, a dried, pressed flower that crumbled to dust at my touch, and at the bottom, a small, faded children's primer, the kind used to teach the alphabet. It felt strangely heavy. I picked it up, and as I did, a single folded piece of paper slipped from between its pages and fluttered onto the floor. I quickly snatched it up before Rebecca could turn around. My heart was hammering. I unfolded the paper. It was yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, but the handwriting was clear. It was a letter, written in the careful, looping script of a young girl. It began, "Dearest Clara." My blood ran cold. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, who had written this. I read the words, and a voice from the grave began to speak. She wrote of being lonely, of missing her sister. She wrote of the pastor, of his nightly prayers, and then I read the lines that changed everything. He thinks I am a foolish girl, but I am not. I watch him. He keeps a little black book locked in the big drawer of his desk. I saw him do it. He writes our names in it, Clara. I saw my own name. He calls us his special servants, but I think we are just a list of names in his book. If anything bad happens to me, if I don't get out of this house, I need you to tell someone. Please don't forget. Tell them to look for the book. It was signed simply, Your loving sister, Sarah Ellen. The letter trembled in my hand. It was a voice from the grave, a prayer that had been left unanswered for years. Sarah Ellen. She hadn't just been a passive victim. She had been a witness. She knew. She had tried to sound the alarm, and with this faded piece of paper, she had just passed the duty of testifying on to me. My fear, which had been a wild, frantic thing, suddenly became focused. It was no longer just about saving myself. It was about answering the plea of a dead girl who had died trying to do the same thing. The weight of that little black book in his desk suddenly felt 10 times heavier. It wasn't just a secret I had to keep anymore. It was a story I had to tell. But I knew that telling a story like that in a town like Bamberg, a town that worshipped the man who wrote it, wasn't just dangerous. It was a death sentence. The weight of Sarah Ellen's letter was a physical thing. I sewed it, along with the few precious dollars I'd managed to skim from the housekeeping money over the years, into the hem of my oldest, plainest dress. It became my secret armor, a constant reminder of the promise I now carried. My fear didn't go away, but it changed. It became a cold, hard thing in the pit of my stomach, a stone of purpose. I started watching, waiting, not even knowing what I was waiting for. I just knew that the time for quiet suffering was over. My life had become a long, slow prayer for an opportunity, a crack in the wall just wide enough for me and my children to slip through. Every day was a performance, every submissive nod a lie, every moment of silence a rehearsal for a future I couldn't yet see. In the middle of this silent internal war, I realized I was pregnant again. My 4th child. Another soul tied to this man, another reason I couldn't fail. The news settled not with terror, but with a grim, urgent resolve. The timeline had been shortened. My body was a clock, ticking down the months until another baby would be in my arms, another life I'd be responsible for saving. I'd look at my 3 children, Samuel, David, and little Leah, and the fierce, protective love I felt for them was so strong it was a physical pain in my chest. They were good, sweet children, innocent of the darkness that had conceived them. They deserved a life where they weren't defined by their father's sins, where the word father didn't taste like fear. The moment that shattered my waiting came on a bright Sunday morning in the fall. The church was filled with the scent of autumn leaves clinging to people's coats. The sermon was the usual fire and brimstone, full of righteousness and holy pronouncements. And then it happened. Pastor Caldwell paused, a look of beatific inspiration spreading across his face. A look I now knew was as false as a $3 bill. He told the congregation that God had visited him again, that a new blessing was upon them. My blood ran cold. I knew what was coming. He announced that the Lord had chosen another handmaiden, another pure young vessel, to walk the sacred path. And then he said her name, Linda Sue Patterson. A whisper went through the pews. I knew Linda Sue, a quiet, shy 15-year-old with freckles and wide, frightened eyes who sang in the youth choir. My gaze shot across the sanctuary and found her, sitting between her proud, beaming parents. And I saw it. I saw her face. It was a perfect, horrifying mirror of my own from all those years ago. The confusion, the terror, the crushing weight of an honor she never asked for. I saw her parents, tears of joy in their eyes, just like my own mother's. I saw the whole dark, twisted play beginning all over again, with a new girl cast in the lead role. I was watching my own past unfold, and I felt a rage so pure and so powerful, it burned away every last shred of my hesitation. In that instant, seeing the terror on Linda Sue's face, my decision was made. It wasn't even a choice anymore. It was a command that came from the deepest part of my soul, from the ghosts of Sarah Ellen and the others, from the fierce love for my own children, and from the 15-year-old girl I used to be. I would not stand by and watch him do it again. I would not let another girl be led into that darkness. My purpose, the one I had been waiting for, was suddenly crystal clear. I had to run, and I had to do it now. That night was the longest of my life. The pastor was in high spirits, accepting the congratulations of the deacons who came by the house, all of them praising God's mysterious ways. Sister Rebecca was a pale wraith, her face a mask of tragedy as she served them coffee. I went about my duties in a calm, methodical daze. I bathed my children and put them to bed, kissing their sleeping faces and whispering a promise that they would wake up somewhere safe. My mind was a whirlwind of planning, calculating and praying. Praying for strength, praying for courage, praying that the darkness would hide us. When the house finally fell silent, when the snores from the master bedroom told me the monster was asleep, I began to move. I gathered my children, one by one, from their beds, shushing them into a sleepy silence. I dressed them in their warmest clothes. I collected the mason jar from its hiding place in the back of the pantry, the few dollars and coins inside sounding like a king's ransom. I put on the dress with Sarah Ellen's letter sewn into the hem. I stood there in the dark kitchen, my 4 children, 3 sleeping and 1 growing inside me, my only worldly possessions. I looked at the back door of the parsonage. The world I knew, a world of pain and fear, was inside this house. A world I didn't know, full of dangers I couldn't even imagine, was on the other side. Both seemed ready to swallow me whole. But I knew I couldn't save the girls in the past. I could only try to break the cycle for the one in the future. And so, with my heart hammering against my ribs, I reached out and turned the knob. Turning that doorknob was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. In the dead quiet of the parsonage, it felt like a gunshot, a betrayal of the silence that had kept me alive for so long. The cold night air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and freedom. And for a second, I froze. This was it. The point of no return. With my youngest, Leah, asleep on my shoulder, and my 2 boys, Samuel and David, clutching my skirt with sleepy, confused hands, I slipped out into the darkness. Each step on the gravel path felt like a betrayal, a landmine I expected to go off. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of the pastor's house, expecting the lights to flash on, to hear his voice boom across the yard, dragging us back into the nightmare. But there was only silence. We moved through the sleeping streets of Bamberg like fugitives, which is what we were. Every shadow seemed to leap out at me, the familiar shapes of my hometown twisted by the darkness into monsters. The ancient oak tree in the town square, where I'd played as a child, now looked like a gallows, its branches reaching for me. The church steeple, that landmark of my youth, was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a dark, pointed finger accusing me to the heavens. I could feel the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, even from behind the closed curtains of the houses we passed. My children were whimpering now, the cold starting to seep into their bones. I pulled them tighter, whispering promises of warmth and safety that I had no idea if I could keep. My own fear was a physical thing, a cold knot of dread that made it hard to breathe. All I could do was put one foot in front of the other, moving toward the edge of town, toward the highway, toward an escape that felt more and more impossible with every step. We finally made it to the crossroads where the long-distance buses stopped. There was no station, just a rickety wooden bench under a single flickering street lamp that cast more shadows than light. The wind was sharp, and it cut right through our thin coats. I huddled my children together on the bench, trying to shield them with my own body. A wave of utter despair washed over me. I looked at the few crumpled dollars in my hand. It wasn't enough. The first bus to anywhere wasn't scheduled to arrive until dawn, still hours away. We were stranded, exposed. A lone woman with 3 small children, huddled on a roadside in the middle of the night. He would wake up. He would find us gone. It wouldn't take him long to figure out where we'd go. I had failed. In my desperate dash for freedom, I had only led my children to a colder, more open cage. I was huddled there, tears freezing on my cheeks, when a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, coming down the road slow and deliberate. My heart stopped. The light swept over us, pinning us to the bench like butterflies in a case. This was it. He'd found us. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the sound of his voice, for the feel of his hand on my arm, for the end of everything. The car door opened with a soft click. I held my breath, but the voice that spoke was not his. It was a frantic, terrified whisper. "Celestine?" I opened my eyes. Bathed in the weak glow of the car's interior light stood Sister Rebecca. She looked like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes wide with a terror that matched my own. For a confused moment, I thought she was there to drag me back, to do his bidding. But then I saw her hands, and they were trembling as much as mine. "I heard the floorboard in the hall," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I knew. I always knew you had more fight in you than I ever did." She lunged forward and pressed a thick, lumpy envelope into my hand. "I can't go," she whispered, her eyes darting back toward the dark road leading to town. "He'd find me. He'd kill me. But I won't let him have you. I won't let him have these babies." She looked at my children, and a look of profound, heartbreaking love and sorrow washed over her face. "It's not much," she said, nodding at the envelope. "It was my mother's inheritance. Money he never knew about. It's enough. Go to Charleston. It's big enough to get lost in. Don't stop. Don't look back." Just then, we heard it. The low, distant rumble of an engine. The dawn bus, coming early. A miracle. "Go!" she urged, pushing me toward the sound. "I found the letter you left on your pillow. I'll make sure he gets it. I'll make sure he reads your words." She gave my arm one last, desperate squeeze, a final, silent message of solidarity passing between us. Then she turned, ran back to her car, and disappeared into the night. The bus pulled up, its air brakes hissing like a great, tired beast. I didn't hesitate. I pushed my sleepy children up the steps, paid the driver with the money from Rebecca's envelope, and collapsed into a seat in the back. The doors folded shut, sealing us in. As the bus pulled away from the curb, its engine a low, steady groan. I stared at our reflection in the dark glass. A terrified woman, pregnant and clutching 3 small children. We were free. But as the lights of Bamberg, the only home I had ever known, faded into a single speck of light behind us, I knew I hadn't just escaped a man. I had escaped my own life. I thought that escape was the end of the story, but I was about to find out it was just the beginning of the war. Life in Charleston was hard, but it was a good kind of hard. It was the honest ache of a long day's work, not the soul-deep exhaustion of living a lie. My 4th child, a beautiful girl I named Hope, was born in a small charity hospital, and she was the first of my babies I could welcome into the world with a heart free of fear. We lived in a tiny 2-room apartment in a noisy part of the city, and I scrubbed floors and washed dishes until my hands were raw, but we were free. My children could laugh out loud. They could run in the park. They could be children, without the weight of a dark secret shadowing their every move. For the first time, I felt like a real mother. The fear of being found never truly left me. It was a low hum beneath the surface of my days. But for the first time in my life, the future was a blank page, and as terrifying as that was, it was also a profound gift. I had escaped the story he was writing for me, and now I could finally start my own. For years I heard nothing from Bamberg. I cut all ties, melted into the anonymity of the city, and built a new life from the ground up. The past was a locked room I never visited. Then, nearly 5 years after my escape, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me in unfamiliar handwriting, forwarded from the women's shelter where I had first stayed. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter wasn't from anyone I knew. It was from a woman named Clara, Sarah Ellen's older sister. She wrote that she had gotten my name from a social worker who had helped one of the other women. And then she told me everything. My escape, she said, had been like a stone thrown into a still, dark pond. My disappearance with 4 of the pastor's children was a scandal that could not be silenced. The letter I had left, which Sister Rebecca had bravely passed to a trusted deacon, was the first crack in the dam. People started whispering, and for the first time, the whispers were questions, not just gossip. Dorothy May, the elderly cleaning woman, finally told her story to that same deacon, giving him the names of the other girls. Then, spurred on by my act, one of the women who had been sent away years ago found the courage to come back. She had a family of her own now, and she came back to Bamberg and told the truth about why she had been forced to leave. Her testimony encouraged another to speak out. The final stone that caused the avalanche was Linda Sue Patterson. Her parents, horrified by the stories that were now circling the town and seeing the proof of my empty room in the parsonage, snatched their daughter back from the pastor's guidance. They went straight to the state police. An official investigation was opened. They searched the church, the parsonage, and, Clara wrote, they found it. They found his office, his desk, and inside a locked drawer, they found a small, black, leather-bound ledger. My ledger. Sarah Ellen's ledger. His whole horrific system laid bare in his own meticulous handwriting. He was arrested. Clara wrote that the trial tore Bamberg apart. But the truth, as ugly as it was, came out. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He died there 15 years ago, a forgotten old man. Sister Rebecca, Clara said, sold the parsonage, gave the money to the church, and left town the day after he was sentenced. No one ever heard from her again. She had found her own quiet way to be free. Linda Sue went on to college and became a teacher, the very thing Rebecca had once dreamed of being. The cycle was broken. Reading that letter, I sat down on the floor of my little apartment and I cried. Not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of release. The weight I had been carrying, the ghosts of those girls, the fear of the monster. It was all lifted. The war was finally over. Today, I'm 81 years old. My 4 children are grown, with families of their own. They are good, kind, successful people who know every part of my story. They know the darkness they came from, but they chose to live in the light. For decades, I've used my experience to help other women, to create small, safe places for those running from the kind of abuse that cloaks itself in the Word of God. I learned that the most dangerous predators are the ones who use faith as a mask, and that the greatest weapon against them is a single voice brave enough to tell the truth. Sometimes, I still feel a twinge of guilt for the years I lost, for the time it took me to see the truth. But then I look at my children, at my grandchildren, and I understand. I was just a child, manipulated by a man who should have protected me. God, the real God, the one I talk to in the quiet of my own heart. He doesn't choose children to be abused. He chooses survivors to be warriors. This is how a life that was meant to be a secret became a testimony. If my story has moved you, find the courage to speak your own truth, or to be a safe harbor for someone else to speak theirs, because every voice matters in the fight against the dark. I'm still here, and I want to know what you think. And tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my words are reaching.